One day, a physics teacher was in class teaching students about the law of the pendulum. I know that many of you might not know what this is because you're either in high school a long time ago or not yet in high school. Those of you in high school probably know what I'm talking about if you've taken physics already. But basically the gist of the law is if you bring a pendulum, one of the things you would find in a clock or things that swing from this side to that side, if you bring it to a certain point and you release it, it's not going to return to the same point on its return swing. So this particular day, like any good teacher, he had an experiment planned, and this experiment involved hanging a 50-pound kettlebell, one of the things ladies use in the gym to swing and exercise like that, and he hung it from the ceiling. And apparently, the idea was to sit a student up on a desk. Let's say there's a desk here. There's a chair right here. You're supposed to sit a student up on a desk, hang the pendulum from the ceiling, pull it up against the student's nose, and release it, let it swing to the other side of the room, and come back. Apparently, this was supposed to illustrate the law of the pendulum, although probably on more intimate terms than anybody would like. But unfortunately for the teacher, when he called for volunteers during this particular class period, nobody raised their hands. I wonder why. And instead, there was calls for him to be the one sitting up in this chair. And so I started to stammer, try to make excuses, get around it, but he couldn't. So all too soon, the teacher found himself up on this chair, his own contraption, with a metal ball pressed against his nose. All too soon, he felt the rush of air as it swung from his nose all the way across to the other side of the classroom. Tried to maintain some composure as he watched the heavy weight swing from his side of the room to the other and begin to return. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. But the silence didn't last very long as it erupted into loud laughter because the teacher rolled off the chair and took a diving leap to the floor. Now, we find the teacher's actions amazing. I mean, he was teaching this law and acted like he didn't believe it. But how often do we act the same way? I'll come back and touch on this later. The Adventist Church in North America is sleeping, and each of us is part of the problem. Satan has succeeded in crippling our church at the most fundamental level, the individual. There's lots of ways he's done this. Not all of them are the ones that we normally think of, but the goal of my sermon today is just to highlight some of these, to find the solutions to them. The number one problem that I found, which is probably the most obvious one too, is prosperity. Which, in fact, you can say we Americans are overly prosperous. Too much luxury, too much leisure, and almost little or no persecution whatsoever, at least for the time being. Prosperity isn't bad in itself, but in most cases, prosperity eventually leads to self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency leads into lethargy and laziness, which in turn leads to idleness, which, as our parents have said for generations, is the devil's workshop. This same idleness and lethargy trickles into the church, little by little, and eventually we carry this idleness and lethargy in the church where it's so easy to just sit down and become a pew warmer. Just sit in the same spot every week warming a pew. This allows Satan an opportunity to slip his dangerous theories into unwary prey. The second problem I found in my study is division. Division, which often leads to separation and isolation of groups. Jesus says in Luke 11, verse 17, that every kingdom divided against itself is laid waste, and a divided household falls. Satan obviously knows that a divided church is easy prey. One of the causes of this division, I think, is a loss of mission. Something I've noticed, just personally, I've traveled to other countries, it's actually past 3 months, but in places where people are busy, they're active in church, doing outreach in the community, where they have a defined and purposeful mission, you see a little or no division at all. I believe it's because they're busy doing what God has called and asked them to do, rather than wasting time, squabbling, labeling, etc. Instead, there's camaraderie, unity, and a defined purpose as a whole. All entities, all individuals pushing together towards a common goal. Division to groups, camps, liberals, conservatives doesn't exist. I think that if we hadn't lost our mission, God's work would be moving at a rapid pace as it is in other areas of the world. The third problem that I came across, leaving tough work to others. We just don't want to get our hands dirty anymore. Instead of fixing problems, we spend forever talking about them, which actually, if you've noticed, doesn't help anyone. Think of how you, yes, you, can fix a problem instead of talking about it. Remember, things, organizations included, are changed from within, not without. We talk about, for example, that our schools may not be what they used to be. What can you do to change that? Does anybody here know the story of everybody, somebody, nobody, and anybody? I know, yeah. I learned this story in second grade at school. The story goes like this. Everybody was sure somebody would do it. Anybody could have done it, but nobody did. Somebody got angry because it was everybody's job. Everybody knew that anybody could do it, but nobody realized that everybody wouldn't. It ended up that everybody blamed somebody, and nobody did what anybody could have done. Hope you caught the message of that little poem. No, it's second grade, but I think it's still relevant. Poor somebody, put way too much work on somebody's shoulders. I think it's too much. It's probably more weight than anybody should carry. And just think about it. Wouldn't it be fair that when God comes back to give every man his reward according to his deeds, isn't it fair that our reward will belong to somebody? Just saying. These problems that I've mentioned so far have connected and fundamental root. What I thought it was, or think it is not having a full understanding of God's love. If you don't believe me, check this out. Let's take a look at something we can say most Americans love. Can you guess what it is? Food is one, but let's not go there. Football. A sport that titles its games championship games in Roman numerals, because what's good enough for Julius Caesar is good enough for the NFL. Its governing body has more power in the life of Americans than probably even the president or the Pope. Think about it. Now, I just have to turn myself in. I'm a big NFL fan myself. How about them Cowboys? And so kind of talking to myself here too. But I want you to imagine What would happen if we applied our sports fanaticism to church? I've been reading a book this past week. It's by Kyle Idleman. He's not an Adventist, but he's a pastor of Southeast Christian Church in Louisville, and best-selling author of Not a Fan. In his book, it's called Gods at War, by the way, Defeating the Idols That Battle for Your Heart. In chapter 7, verse 113, page 113, he says, see if you can imagine this one. People arrive hours early for church. On Sunday mornings, or case Saturday, they don't just set a backup alarm to assure they wake up in time. They set a backup for the backup. They arrange their schedules to make sure that they don't miss gathering for worship. Throughout the week, they talk about what happened on the previous Sunday as excitement builds for the upcoming church service. There are all-day talk shows on the radio devoted to reviewing last week's service and breaking down the next one. There's even a TV show called Church Center that runs highlight clips of church activities that have happened across the nation that day. When Sunday comes, the members start loading up their trucks, SUVs, and sedans hours before the service starts. Hurry, says Dad frantically. We're behind again. It's 6 a.m., says Mom. Church doesn't start again for 5 hours. Well, last time we left at this time, we had to park 3 miles from the sanctuary and sit in the nosebleed seats. Someday, I really want to sit in that front row, but you have to camp out on the church lawn to have any chance at that. The roads are really congested on the way to church, no matter how early you leave. At church, there are vehicles parked as far as the eye can see, and folks are out tailgating. Some have elaborate spreads prepared, breaking out portable grills and lawn chairs in the church parking lot. Some have television monitors and satellite dishes so they can catch updates from other worship services while they wait for their own. It's nice weather today, not that that matters. Even in the dead of winter, they'll be out here in the same numbers. The masses begin filing into the sanctuary, cheering with great passion and excitement. Once the service starts, the people are all on their feet, not that they ever sit down. Of course, a bunch of young guys are in the front row. They've probably been here since Friday night. They have no shirts, and each one has a letter on his chest. Together, they spell, "Get your tithe on." Apparently, the rumor has gotten out that the pastor is indeed going to teach on biblical stewardship and worshiping God with our money. Everyone is pumped for the giving sermon. It's one of the highlights of the year. After several watches, people start looking at their watches. Not that it's lunchtime, but everybody's thinking the same thing. I hope the sermon goes into overtime. So he goes into this next section, it's headed The Church That Peyton Built. And so he talks about all his daughter would ask for Christmas for her 4th birthday was a Peyton Manning jersey and a ticket to go to an Indianapolis Colts game. And so he gave her that, and he's an NFL fan, so he was quite willing to take her out to watch this Colts game. But they travel to this place on Saturday night, and they wake up early on Sunday and go to a church. First thing the daughter asks him, "Daddy, can I wear my Colts jersey to church?" He says, "No, nobody's going to be wearing their Colts jersey to church, daughter." And they get there, there's 38 people with Colts jerseys on in there. 2 people had their face painted already. And so they go to this football game and they enjoy it, and I'll pick up here. But on the drive home, as my exhausted daughter slept, I couldn't help but think about the fact that I had really attended 2 worship services that day. The question I was asking myself was, which one was I most passionate about? Wouldn't be hard to make a case that our cultural obsession with entertainment is essentially a surrogate religion. But let's stay with sports specifically for a moment. Charles S. Prebish, a professor of religious studies at Penn State University, doesn't believe our passion for it is like a religion, flat out says it is one. America's newest and fastest growing religion, far outdistancing what is in second place. Its temples are the great stadiums that are sacred ground to many, sites of weekend pilgrimages. Its priests are in the zebra stripes. Its gods wear their names on the back of their jerseys. Its liturgy is fan chants, and its sacrifices are the vast amounts of money that fans pay for tickets and team gear. I want you all to think on that for a second. Now do you understand why I can say we have an incomplete understanding of God's love? If we did, wouldn't we live our lives much differently? If we did, we'd be on fire for him, much more on fire for him than we are for football. I have another quote that's just going to stick the nails in the coffin on this issue. It comes from a book, devotional by Ellen White, called In Heavenly Places. It's page 58, the last paragraph. And it says, "In the life of man, things sacred and things secular are to be done. Some in business lines, some in the ministry of the word, and some in various trades. But when a man gives himself to Christ and loves God with the whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, he serves with a devotion that takes his whole being. He recognizes the ownership of his powers and the ownership of himself. This consecration invests his whole life with a sacredness which makes him gentle, kind, and courteous. His every act is a consecrated act. He is under Christ, being trained for the higher grade above." The last thing I have to mention is a lack of real faith. This is also somewhat tied with what I've mentioned so far. But we claim so often that we have faith. But I'm afraid that so often we are like the teacher in the first story that I told about the pendulum. We don't always have the type of faith that we claim we have. Where I'm going now is going to be specific to our church and the situation we're in now, especially in regards to our search for a building. But before we talk, let's read a story that we all know, the story of the talents, which is found in Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30, if you all want to turn there. Are you there yet? Okay, verse 14. "For it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he who had 2 talents made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. And he who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here are made 5 talents more." Skip to verse 22. "And he also who had the 2 talents came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here I have made 2 talents more." Skip to verse 24. And I can imagine this third guy speaking in a whiny voice like a little kid. "Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours." But his master answered him and said, "You wicked and slothful servant, you knew that I reap where I have not sown and gather where I have scattered no seed? Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast this worthless servant into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth." I have a little Ellen White quote here. It's called "Set the Standard High." It says, "Many whom God has qualified to do excellent work accomplish very little because they attempt little. Thousands pass through life as if they had no definite object for which to live, no standard to reach. Such will obtain a reward proportionate to their works. Remember that you will never reach a higher standard than you yourself set. Press with determination in the right direction, and circumstances will be your helpers, not your hindrances. What I think we get from this story is that God has entrusted us with certain things already, but you can't expect to get more unless you use what you already have. I want you all to think on that for a second. Take it and apply it to the situation our church is right now. Church is in right now. Ask yourselves the question, what have I done with what God has given us so far? We've had 2 buildings, several time extensions, I guess, to raise money. Could it be possible that God is waiting on us instead of us waiting on him? Possible that it's a simple test. We all know that God has no problem with the money, but how does he know that we will do what we will say, what we say we will? Or will our good intentions and words just turn out to be ropes of sand? How can he know unless we use what we have now? We can say we're maxed out, the building can't hold anymore. But is it possible that if God saw a group of people that we've reached out to and brought in, basically ready to push us beyond that max that a building can hold, it's possible that that just might be when he will work a miracle. No amount of crafting, talking numbers and figures, it's really going to get us where we need to be. Could be possible that God has donors lined up already who are watching, just like he is, to see if we'll step out in faith and start doing what we've said we will do before they just throw their eggs in our basket. Maybe like the faithful servant in the story, when he sees the talents he's given us put to good use, he'll give us more. We often read stories about miracles in the lives of others. When there was no coal to last the night, no food left for the orphans in an orphanage, and God provided. But one of the keys in those stories that we don't always think about is people were faithful stewards. They stepped out in faith. For example, instead of praying for food for the orphans and then waiting for the food to come, then calling the orphans, would pray, call the orphans from the street, and the food would come in later. God provides. God doesn't see that kind of faith and just be silent. He'll do something. All we need to do is to cast all fear aside and be bold. We need to ask ourselves, why not us? Why not me? Others have received. Why not us? Then take steps forward about it and ask God. Then God can look and say, well, they've used what I've given them well. I think I can give them something bigger now. The big thing here, running out of time, is we can talk all we want, but until we really get serious, we'll never get anywhere. We can talk about the end of time, the Pope coming to America, etc. But if we don't show an urgency about it, what's the use? I sometimes fear that Jesus will come back and look at some of us, and unfortunately, we'll be like the servant who buried his talent in the ground, really, just empty-handed. In closing, I want to leave you with a few thoughts. Thought number 1, are you being active? Or are you leaving somebody else, your pastors, elders, Doug Batchelor, Ivor Myers, etc., the work that you should be doing? Remember, if somebody else does the work, it's only fair for them to receive the reward. Number 2, do you really believe what you profess to believe? Rather, act like you believe. Or are you like the professor on the kettlebell? Or are you like the example of football? You have that passion for football or something else, cars, anything, but not that passion for God's work. Number 3, last and final point. Work. The night is coming. Don't be comfortable where you are, because the world out there isn't that comforting. Don't be satisfied to just sit in church and be fed. There's others out there in the world that are hungry. They can use the food. And most of all, step out in faith. God will provide.